Bonsoir à tous et à toutes et bienvenue à l'espace commune. Juste une petite annonce, cette table ronde va être en anglais. Donc j'espère que c'est bon pour la plupart d'entre vous. Mais voilà, c'était juste pour vous prévenir au cas où. So good evening everyone and welcome to the Espace Commune. My name is Maxime Benvenuto. I'm a researcher and educator in the design field in the Netherlands, and I'll have the great pleasure of moderating our conversation tonight, which will be on the topic of queer design practices. Now, discussing queer design practices can be a little bit of a tricky exercise because a lot of queer design practices have been invisibilized throughout history. Most of histories actually tend to neglect many voices, be it the ones of queer people or women or people of colors. And that's something that makes it always difficult then to voice and make seen certain traditions and certain strands of practices. And that's what we're going to try to unpack a little bit today, as much as we can within the time we have, at least, through the practices of our guest, which is what are the mechanisms that allow to make visible or that constrain people to be made invisible within the narratives that inhabit the design field. And for this, I have three wonderful guests that all came from abroad to join us today. So Floriane Fo Misselin, Léo Maher, and Colin Keays, thank you so much for joining us, for making the effort also of traveling to Paris for this discussion. It's really great to see you all here in person. And to start with, I would like to let you introduce yourselves and your practices and just hear a little bit about what it is that you're working on, how you work through design. And I thought it would be good to start with you, Léo, maybe, because among the three guests, you're perhaps the one that has the most material practice where you're shaping things and so on. So I thought it might be an easier entry point to start with. So if you would like to introduce yourself.
This one is on. Hey, thank you for the brief introduction, Maxime. Yeah, my name's Léo Maher, and I'm a graduate from King's University in London and the Design Academy. I think what I do, the work I do best describes me as a researcher and a designer. And I think this work allows me to sit quite comfortably between this intersection between art and design, where on the one hand it might be most comfortably described as functional art, but it also might be quite as easily comfortably described as sculptural design. That's both an uncomfortable and comfortable dichotomy, how to sit on those fence between those two industries. And I think these kind of queer narratives do kind of push through those more conservative spaces with less limitation perhaps than other modes of work. And most of my work orients around queer theory in some capacity, and that direct histories where a piece might be informed by the lived experience of what it was like to be a queer in a particular era, with that piece giving an indication of that era in its materiality or in its approach to craft or the technique that it uses. Or occasionally it might be more loosely applying queer techniques or lenses or ways of viewing the world into the narrative of the works. So in short, there's the more direct dealing of the working with queer narrative, and then there's the more poetic approach, the work that I guess utilizes queer methodologies in its practice. Two approaches at the same time. And a lot of the works, and I think through some of those examples on the screen, you can see the approach to the materiality is quite kitchen thinky, that it has many different elements and narrative elements and materials and techniques kind of gathered and glued together all into one piece. And they kind of form this conglomerate in a way. And I think this approach really represents how complicated and messy the dealing of these queer histories is, and indeed beyond that, how difficult and sticky these queer histories are in general, or histories are in general. Within my practice approach, there's a research phase and a materialization phase, and the research phase will always feed the materialization. And the research phase is always centralized around this core questioning of what is history. And I'm going to give a brief definition because I think it's important to share this core understanding that everything else critiques as those queer understandings develop. That history is a narrative produced through evidenced past events, that the historic method makes use of primary sources, secondary sources, and material evidence, and that this evidence is housed in an archive which is built and referenced to support the historical understanding. And inside of understanding this, it's crucial to take note of the relation between the past, the present, and the future. And the diagram that I always think of in the relation between these three concepts is like a triad Venn diagram where they overlap in two different ways, where the present always connects those two. And understanding this system means that in owning the past means we can control the present, which means that we can reshape the morphology of the future. And it advocates for this idea that proactivity in the present means owning your heritage and feeling the practice, freeing the practice of our desires and identities into the future in living how we want to live collectively. A little bit more about my understanding of the historic method is that it needs to recognize, this need to recognize our own past and our own future lies in this understanding of history as a powerful myth and not as something of an absolute fact. That we must appreciate that history's evidence exists inside of an archive. And we have to see that archives aren't sporadic entities that conveniently form themselves upon their own goodwill. And it's too easy to think of history as something that simply arises from the ground, that we have to excavate, and it tells us exactly what the narrative is. The problem here is that each archive has been produced and has been compiled by an archiver, and that this archiver comes with a grand array of prejudices, of biases, and it's these personal ideologies that archive houses. It's conditioned by them, its selection process, its program runs through these principles and these ideologies. And to treat this idea as something that's concrete allows us to neatly conclude that what we have as resources, what we have as historic evidence, is simply not the full picture. And our work as practitioners specializing in this field is to make this picture feel more full and more complete. A lot of these ideas, I think, are centered around these ideas of hegemony, that I think is a really important term for all of us working through these kinds of histories and complex narratives. And hegemony, by definition, means leadership or dominance, particularly of one state or one social group over another. And it describes a particular form of domination which succeeds due to the consent from the people or the group being dominated. A really good example, well, a nice, neat example of this is, say, for instance, that a child asks their parent, "Can I have ice cream for dessert?" And the parent says, "No, you can't have ice cream, but you can have an apple or a banana." And because the child has been given a choice, they don't realize that their desire has been taken away from them. When you apply that example into other contexts, you can see how problematic that it can be. And it's important not to see these hegemonies as something that are singular, as something that are unique, but overlap in many different ways, different forms that enact their power over society, political, economic, cultural, sexual, or gender-related hegemonies. But it's important that I think when we start to understand queer histories, that the hegemony that we have to be most concerned with is heteronormativity, that heterosexuality is the norm through which we must all live our lives by, and then we must all adhere to these traditional gender roles in order to do this. In order to recognize it and to fight against it, we have to have an understanding of what mechanisms heteronormative culture employs in order to oppress us. And these might range from queer erasure, the erasure of records of queer lived experience or people. They might be the non-recognition of queer identities, the persecution or the criminalization of them. They might be the assertion of normative or oppressive ideologies, such as the nuclear unit, of mononormativity, the idea that we should only be with one partner, or a metanormativity, the idea that we must be with one partner in general, or a partner in general. I think our duty as practitioners in this field is to train this kind of sixth sense, this sense that allows us to detect some of these missing elements within history, to smell the things that don't quite smell right, and have this sensitivity to find the cracks in these histories, the things that are missing. And this is something that we have to be proactive in, keep addressing and keep re-updating. in the art world, this is referred to as a gallery gaydar, and it's this feeling you have when you're in a gallery and you perceive a painting that feels queer in some capacity, that there's a body language or an imagery or a connection of symbols that feels inherently queer, that obviously belongs to an era where that queer narrative could never have been spoken of. And every new piece of information that we acquire as practitioners must inform how we find this sense and how we find this information. And my application to this in my practice, how I apply this methodology, is that once these queer narratives are discovered, I'll then research more specifically about the historical context, the social and cultural norms surrounding that narrative, legislative norms, what rule or empire they existed under, and how deviant and how subversive those behaviors were at that time. This helps to contextualize this piece of information that it is that I'm dealing with. And then following that, I'll gather research on the material culture of that specific period, which might be gathering imagery or understanding the architecture or interior styles. It might be understanding the materiality or the craft techniques that belong to the time. For instance, like bottle green tiles might belong to the Victorian period, or raw unglaze terracotta, like on this central picture, might denote to excavated pottery from the Roman era, from ancient Greece. And then I'll try and find the symbols that represent those queer narratives, and they might be pragmatic or direct, such as a myth about mermaids might have a mermaid, or they might be more sensitive and poetic. And in this sense, through respecting the materiality and the craft and the material culture of the context, the works try to place those narratives back inside of the context that they arose from. And a lot of the emphasis in doing this is trying to create the missing artifacts from so many of these undocumented or erased histories throughout time.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to check, can you all hear well? Because there is quite a lot of sound coming from downstairs. It's okay? Yeah? All right. Thank you very much. Really nice that you already tapped into the question of the archiver, because I thought it was a nice connection with you, Floriane, looking at how things are being documented and how things are being produced, which echoes quite nicely with your practice. So I would like to give you the mic now to let us know about your work.
Yeah. Yeah, is that working fine? Is it? Yeah, okay. Okay, so what do I do after your explanation? I might explain it a little bit faster or like shorter, but I am not having disclaimer. I'm not having a material practice. I'm doing sociology on the production of fashion photography. And it has some sort of practice through the research method and how I actually do this research and how I interview people. But what I'm looking at, first of all, is it's quite perfectly related to what everyone has been saying so far. It's a lot more about looking at how is the fashion industry working, just looking at fashion photography specifically. And what is actually possible, like how, for instance, when you start to have your idea about a fashion editorial for a magazine or a campaign, the end product might be completely different from the initial ideas, because by the time you develop your ideas, you're going to have the marketing department behind your hats, you're going to have the negotiations to do with the advertisers, with the founder. And so I'm looking at how the process makes things possible, but also impossible. So said a bit more easily, I think it's just also how... Okay, I'm trying to find another entry point into it. Looking into the industry, especially, I take the fashion photography and the fashion industry as a case study, because it's established historically on women's wear and menswear. So it is based on the distinction on gender. You go in a shop and you're going to have two different arrows on whether you're going to shop for men or for women. But then the images fashion is produced mostly through images. It's the images from advertising and from the magazine that are going to tell you what is in fashion at the moment. And a lot of the people that are producing those pictures, it's a lot of people on set and in the process that are identifying LGBTQ AI+. So I'm looking into how do these people experience producing fashion when they work in an industry that needs to be distinguished based on gender. And so how does it feel for someone that is their job to create a desirable picture for a new lipstick or whatever, and how does it feel for them? Is for them they associate lipstick to like the club, the gay club they go in the weekend, but then on Monday they have to produce an image and the editor is going to freak out because they put lipstick on a cisgender male. And so, for instance, the idea of the picture might end up completely differently, because the picture with the guy wearing lipstick is not going to be selected and is not going to make it to the magazine. So that's why I'm looking at all the different negotiations, those kind of, maybe go back to the previous slide, where there's all these negotiations between stylist, photographer, casting director, agencies, magazine. There's a lot of stakeholders in the production of these images that will kind of always negotiate, and especially the interest at the moment for diversity and inclusion. So it's kind of also something to gain as a status for the magazines. They need to kind of tick the box to show that they're inclusive and show that they're diverse at the moment. But the problem is that, so they will ask for more trans people, let's say, to come on set, but no one on set is going to necessarily be trained in like doing gender pronoun correctly, like understanding even that you need a gender neutral changing room for these persons, for instance, or stuff like that. So it's kind of looking really at what is behind the images, but also what are images that are actually never made, kind of, because they get kind of blocked before that. So, yeah. So I'm not looking at all at what's on the picture. I'm not interested in the aesthetics of the picture. I'm interested just in what's before. And then just very briefly to mention about the practice itself, then the diagrams you're seeing there is what I present to participants when I do interviews. So I kind of visualize the negotiations and the kind of networks that I'm interested in. And that's especially because, for instance, it's not a method where I'm going to follow someone doing a fashion shoot, which we would call ethnography, for instance, because it's these kind of negotiations that are not visible in the moment. So when you're on a shoot and someone's going to receive a text message from the editor being really stressed, being like, don't do that, or something like that, I wouldn't witness it, for instance, as someone that just observed the person. So my technique is more to go into interviewing people and their experience, what they remember, and I'm not questioning whether their story is factual or not, because the most important thing is that it left something in them. It's something that they remember. They remember that 3 years ago that happened on set. So then I put all those stories together, and I kind of make diagrams out of all of the stories that were told, and I kind of visualize these processes and share it with more people so that they kind of respond to what other people have said as well. So I kind of circulate those different experiences across as people, and they can respond to those visualizations being like, well, I actually experienced this differently, or I can absolutely relate to that, or it's interesting to see what other people are saying, or stuff like that. So, yeah, that was long enough, no?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm going to let you do the transition.
Thank you very much, Floriane. I would like now to invite you, Colin, because you also have quite a different practice, right? And in your case, you've been going from addressing queer narratives as a subject to almost embodying it, if I may dare to say. So please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I'm a writer, editor, and curator, but with a background in architecture and design. So I think I'd like to just show a couple of examples that kind of go in and out of the subject that Maxime's been introducing. But starting with these ones, I come from a background in architecture, and a lot of my research was really kind of understanding how different marginalized groups carve space for themselves within cities and really looking at their urban context, and specifically how these kinds of are being erased through issues like gentrification and property development, for example. So these are just a couple of projects from several years ago. I kind of had a phase for a few years where I was just obsessed with everything to do with gay bars and trying to like understand what they mean for cities, what the aesthetics of them are, who's going to them, disappearing. So for some projects on the left was I just began planning through photogrammetry a lot of these kinds of spaces and really trying to capture and almost archive these spaces that were rapidly disappearing over time. And that also continued into some more practices. So also creating these performances kind of to tell those narratives. So I think that's maybe the most direct way in my work that I've addressed that subject. But since then, I've kind of moved away from designing per se. It's really something that didn't really feel like it suited my practice so well. With the same ideas in myself as a curator as well. In that sense, a lot of what I like to do in my work is to really question dynamics and question the relationship between design and the institutions that hold the power in presenting that. So this was an example. Last year, I curated the Dutch pavilion at the London Design Biennale in London. This the way these different national exhibitions are based on this kind of competition between nation states. So rather than actually kind of presenting the best Dutch designers and getting them to sort of put their work on a pedestal, really initiated the collaboration between lots of different people to actually work together and create photography, really trying to break down that hierarchy between like this individual authorship of the designer, but also trying to break down the hierarchy of this, national pavilion being funded by an embassy and kind of showcasing the best of their country by actually creating a space where you could remove everything. And so the whole point in this space was all these other different countries' exhibitions could take things from it. So in theory, this room would be completely empty by the end of it and kind of dissolve this idea of authorship and sort of who's holding the power. And yeah, in another project that I've been involved in, very lucky to have been writing on for the last 3 years as editor-in-chief, is called Other Network, and it's a platform that's really questioning sort of how mainstream cultural institutions hold power. So rather than understanding how national museums with their own agendas and their taxpayer funding are kind of producing culture and setting this, or like this is what art is, this is what design is, this is what architecture is, really understanding who's actually producing culture at the margins of society and who's actually these people who are falling outside of those structures and more independent art spaces, how they're actually producing something. So it's a super collaborative project with different research team, mainly based in the Global South across Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. But I think something that's important in understanding this difference between the mainstream culture as well as what falls outside of it is often the most politically radical stuff and the kinds of spaces that people are actually able to engage differently and more politically take place outside of those structures. And that also includes a lot of queer artists that are, able to find their way around censorship, for example. But then maybe circling back one last example off the back of that. Oh, other way? No? Uh-oh. Yeah. I was very fortunate to be working last year in Ghana for several months, in Accra, and with some of the collaborators from this other project. And the context there is obviously very different to a European context. There's very hardcore homophobic legislation. There's a whole anti-LGBT bill in Parliament that just passed. And so creatives there don't actually have the freedom to be able to express their work in the way they'd want to, because you're not going to be able to get a job if you're kind of, out there as a queer artist in the same way as you're able to just, you're not going to get the same exhibitions and galleries, not be able to talk about this. So this project was super collaborative with the editorial team I was working with there, really to just give a platform for different creatives to be able to share their work in a way that they wouldn't normally be able to, and really represent this particular community in a particular location in the way that they actually want to be seen, in the way they actually want to express themselves. Those are just, maybe it's a bit fragmented, but I think some of the themes maybe cross over as well. Maybe you can keep going with questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for all those introductions. Something that seems to be emerging already, like from the different stories that you've been telling us about your work and about the way you approach things, it's a term that you've said, which is this idea of negotiation and the necessity to negotiate with history and with the hegemonies that are in place, and how do you negotiate outside of the choice that is provided to you, or with the coworkers that don't necessarily understand what's going on, or on how to create shared narratives in a different way outside of the hierarchies or the traditional hierarchies that we find in institutions. I was wondering if that's something that you could perhaps reflect a little bit on, like specifically, how is this negotiating taking place in your practice? If one of you wants to kickstart. Floriane?
Can you also go back to the diagram for work? I'm quite curious also, because I think that almost illustrates it quite directly.
Is this one working? Is this one a good one to work? Okay, cool. Negotiation itself is like the core of my project. So obviously then I think what's different maybe in the way that I might answer this question is that I don't negotiate myself really. I do negotiations as well, but it's not the one we're talking about. So I more study the negotiations or the weight of negotiation. I think one thing I can think of based on our previous conversation as well is the kind of how I'm looking and studying negotiations then in a way is to look at two things. Eventually the restrictions, the limitations around creativity that people might receive in those processes. So it's about basically, limiting the choices, if we go back to choice, that you might have in producing a picture. But I'm looking especially at the responses to the restrictions. So not just like, oh, you cannot do that, or how you're getting blocked by a model agency about a specific thing. But I'm really interested in looking at the responses, the strategies that are put in place. I'm calling them like alternatives or workarounds. So if someone tells you, no, you cannot put this guy on a high hill, then it's going to usually be something else is going to happen. Someone's going to find another thing that they can do to keep doing what they want, basically. So it's looking both at how things are getting managed, but also how there's a way to always bypass this. And in another way, I'm also looking at how a lot of the new organizations that are made, like certain new magazines or new model agencies, are also created out of frustration and previous experiences of not being able to do what they want and how they want to do it. So an alternative often is to make a new magazine that is not working with any advertisers, so people can just do whatever they want with these pictures, for instance, or stuff like that. So I think that could be my short answer for the negotiations. The one I'm looking at is not just the no, but then the kind of what's going to be the alternative, and also how those alternatives of all those new ways of producing fashion that might come up. So for instance, even small things is like some person is going to make it how do you say that again? A regular thing to do an introduction to pronouns between all staff before a day of work or something like that. So there's new practices that come, and to me they build up becoming conventions afterwards. So it's things do change over the time because of all this previous bad experience, all those struggles from before, and people found other ways of doing it, and these new ways are going to become more expected practice. So in that sense, that's also how those negotiations are really valuable to the industry, because they do put in place new ways of producing fashion that are much more inclusive than just having cute trans person on a cover. So it's more about the background. Yeah. What about negotiations for you?
I felt totally inept to answer this question when you first said it, and listening to you both explain your practices, it's really, I'm in awe that your principles and how you want to live your life and create your practice is a direct relationship with a corporation or with an industry that you do have to negotiate with day to day. My practice is a little bit more isolated, and I don't necessarily have to directly negotiate with an industry, but I feel like it's impossible to talk about negotiation without respecting ideas of hierarchy. And within any kind of system of hierarchy, when there's a negotiation at play, you know, this map is maybe not quite as linear as a traditional hierarchical one, but we can understand there's different hierarchies between the titles of people or the professions of people on this map. And for a concession to be made upon someone else's ideology within a system of hierarchy, it means at a certain point, someone's probably going to have to put their neck on the line. And that takes courage. And I guess a lot of our kind of work and the discourse that we're trying to create is to make people feel that courage. And I feel like if our work can do anything, not only can it touch people's lives, not only can it help other queer people, not only can it make more visibility, but it can instill this piece of courage that allows this more systemic change to start to happen. And I think in any case, any kind of social justice movement, it follows this same kind of pathway. And first, you see the thing, you see the person, you see the identity, you see the situation. Secondly, you hear about it. And then thirdly, you feel it. And that feeling causes empathy. And once you have that empathy, it's a lot easier to transfer that feeling into courage. And that can create a behavior that can start to change something, that can lead some kind of progress, you know?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really nice way to frame it. I mean, for me, I think there's also a lot of question of like who the institutions are that are kind of setting the agenda, and this difficulty of negotiating with people in positions of power, right? Negotiating with institutions where... What was the last thing you heard? And I think there's a certain level of access to power that goes along with that, and not everybody has access to, you know, the director of an institution or an editor of a magazine, these kinds of things. And so I think this question of access is super important, and questioning where your agency lies also. Like, I think understanding that sort of sense of privilege of who has access in that respect, but then also a lot of people have their own power in numbers, for example. So if you're collaborating with lots of other people and there's a lot of different voices getting together, and kind of that can then have an equal weight maybe to an institution, if that's through like an activist movement or something, that can kind of question and challenge these institutions. So on one hand, some people are working within these systems, but on the other hand, that should never disregard the people who are working outside of these systems and maybe never will be accepted by these systems. Yeah, so I think it's a bit of a back and forth.
Here? Yeah. I was also thinking with what you were both mentioning about because again, this visibility might sound always like a kind of goal or something that we aspire to, but I think with what I'm looking at is also really noticing the cost of visibility, especially in the sense of, again, as I mentioned before, now it's being desired because it's seen as a potential profit, a potential gain to have a lot more diversity in your magazine. But there's so many case studies that are really interested in how that visibility really has a cost. Because once people are exposed, they're not necessarily being protected afterwards. So I think there's something about the courage, but there's also about the self-preservation a lot. I think there's this kind of sense sometimes that it's better to not be too exposed. It's a lot more safe. So I think that's a negotiation in itself also. Like, how much visibility and in which condition and at what cost and what comes after. What's the support surrounding this visibility? Otherwise, it's just really dangerous.
Yeah, I think there's certainly a balance that's very context specific as well between visibility and safety, right? I think, sometimes visibility can be kind of a goal to reach actual like rights beyond that, but also in certain contexts, that visibility can be very dangerous. And I think that's something really with a lot of the people I was working with in Ghana on this project. It was all about visibility and it was all about being seen, but actually we would put people at risk if that magazine was actually explicitly framed as a queer magazine, right? It was kind of this tongue-in-cheek way of framing visibility, and we had to be incredibly cautious in the wording to not actually legally implicate anyone as a queer person. So sometimes actually that visibility is this double-edged sword, and you're kind of having to negotiate this boundary between how far can you push it in one direction where people are feeling seen and recognized, and maybe that's only being seen and recognized by people within their own community, and which almost made me think of what you were saying with this gallery gaydar, maybe a bit off topic, but there's sometimes this kind of subversive kind of visibility which I think can be even more powerful, right? Like someone in the know can kind of recognize a little signifier, or in your work, for example, right? Someone might recognize like the gesture of a hand or something and actually spot that as something inherently queer, but actually that can slip under the radar to a lot of other people. Oh yeah.
Yeah, and I think you're really right to point out that different contexts require different kind of negotiation, right? But I was curious also because when we had a discussion before, we talked of your work, Colin, as a curator, also at the New Institute, which is the Dutch Institute for Architecture, Fashion and Digital Culture, and which has one of the largest architecture archives of the Netherlands, I think, right? And when you described your work there, and that resonates, I think, a lot with what you've just said. You talked of yourself as a curator that was a diplomat, right? And trying to step out of that position of authority that says what is not, what should be seen, what should not be seen, but involving all the stakeholder in the process and the artists. Could you maybe tell us a little bit more about this?
Yeah, I think it maybe comes back to this idea of who the audience of a particular work is again, and I think that's where almost this element of diplomacy in any kind of creative practice comes in, because you need to understand how to communicate an idea to, someone with a political background who's maybe interested in this work for a particular reason, but also to a general public audience, or maybe even specifically a queer general public, or all these different sort of layers of actually who's going to be seeing the work. You also have to negotiate that. You can't just kind of assume that everyone's going to get it. It's also okay if you have to explain something in one way differently to a different audience, right? And I think that comes across with any kind of work, right? I think that's maybe how I would frame it.
And then, of course, thinking of the archive, you mentioned it, right? The role of the archivist and so on. And I was curious because when you talk about your work, or at least when we talked about it together, I don't remember hearing it now, but you talked about it as retaliation also, right? Against a system of narratives which is in place, but that you're also making it so that those narratives get the tangible presence in those archives as well, where they've been denied to be. I was wondering if you could maybe unpack this a little bit, and how do your work usually enter archives, or maybe not?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think it relates to what we were saying formally, and I think it's important to recognize what corporate queerwashing is. And I guess perhaps archives have this same structure, that we have a responsibility to adapt ourselves, to change our morphology, to be more all-encompassing and be more full-bodied without necessarily having the right kind of sensitivity about how to expand itself in the right ways. I've totally lost your question as I've started to go down that tangent. What's the archive?
Yeah, how does your work enter an archive, or how do you relate to that process? Does it enter the archive, and what's its position there?
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. I think the work, it's difficult, and I have friends that say just enacting your queer identities feels like every day an act of protest. For me, I don't feel this weight that my everyday existence is an act of protest, but I think to work in this part of the industry with these kind of ideologies and this kind of discourse, it is an unavoidable act of protest, and it does feel like you're combating some kind of erasure. It feels like you're combating some kind of political power that is fighting back against you, or has at least once fought back against you. And again, I've totally lost my train of thought.
Wrong one. Here.
Sorry, I'm back.
Go for it, then. Go for it.
And I think it's a huge responsibility, and Maxime, I think this relates to your practice as well, that it almost feels in many ways like design has this responsibility to redesign itself. And this idea of what is valued in design is the finite and it's the valuable. It's oriented around materials that are finite, precious stones, precious materials. Inside of this idea of the original is so protected because by the definition of it, it means that it has never been reproduced before, and this is why we give it so much quality, we give it so much value. And there's a metaphor I always like to think about any kind of erasure, but perhaps particularly queer erasure with, and it's almost like the supernova of a star. It's like a star going into blackness, disappearing entirely, and how much awe we give to that moment when we see this shining dot of light go through the sky into nothing. And the same value, I think, needs to be given when we pull something out from the darkness. It's original in its own light because we don't know about it. We've never experienced that thing before. So to create something new has to be at least on the same level as exposing something that has always been and is always there back into some kind of brightness, and to illuminate it. And that's the agency of the archiver that needs to bring this light back into that dark space, that crack, that void.
Beautiful. You wanted to react, Floriane?
Sorry, yeah.
No? I'm just trying to keep an eye on time, to not abuse your time as well as an audience. And we're almost at the limit, so I would like to open the floor to you if you have questions for our guests that you would like to ask or that they haven't tapped into and that you would like to unpack further. No? I mean, they're going to stay around a little bit also, so you can still ask afterwards if you would like to. But then for now, I think it was really short, but I think we're going to keep it at this with this beautiful image that you ended up on, because I don't know how to top it off, to be honest. So thank you so much for coming for the conversation and for opening up the subject together. Thank you also to you, for the audience, for joining us and listening into these stories. Thank you to the technical team for assisting with the sound and video. And thank you to FORMÆ also, who's been organizing all the talks for this Paris Design Week. I invite you to go around, speak with everyone, and enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you.